Are we on? All right. Okay, welcome to our Torah for today, December 19th, 2024. What a pleasure to be able to study with all of you today. Uh, any of you were here last night for Hanukkah, for our pre-Hanukkah celebration? It was mostly religious school, I think, because it was the kids that were performing. It was strange this year, by the way, to think about celebrating Hanukkah the week before Hanukkah. And that's just, it doesn't, but it was great to be able to have them. It's always to show them in terms of remind them how to do the blessings. Um, Everybody remembers how to light the Hanukkah yourselves? Remember? Yeah, you got it, right? You put in the first night, you light them from right to left. You put them in, and then you do the blessing. You light the shamash, you do the blessings, then you light the candle. And then when you have more than one candle, you light from newest night first.
No, it's night
Start
first.
from left to right. Um,
And Rabbi, what do you do on Shabbos?
so Shabbat, you light them before you light the Shabbat candles, and then you do Shabbat candles. Yep. Um, and then it's interesting on Havdalah, which most people assume that it's after you do Havdalah that you would do the lighting of the candles. Um, But when does Shabbat really end on Saturday night? Because the question is, if you haven't ended Shabbat, how do you light the candle for Havdalah?
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
Right? What is there a formal ritual? Is there a prayer? Is there something? Um, and so I encourage you next time you are looking at the Amidah, particularly if it's for the evening Amidah, you will see that there's a paragraph called Atachon Antanu, which has bits of the Havdalah, and it ends it without the formal Havdalah ceremony. So we've actually, through that addition of that one prayer paragraph, we formally end Shabbat, and then you're able to light the strike a match and light the candle for Havdalah. So that's just technically. So next time, if you're in looking at the Siddur or you want a page, but it's only going to be found in the evening, Mari, for one that's eligible, appropriate for the evenings. All right. Yes, Stan, another question?
Well, not a question, but talking about Havdalah, and I remember when COVID came in and you did Aliyah did the lighting of the candles, the Havdalah on Zoom, Rabbi Gokul, and Cantor Stein, and it was really uplifting.
Yeah, remember we did, by the way, we did candle lighting every Friday night on Zoom, and we did Havdalah as well. Yeah, it was great. The numbers diminished over time. I think we started with like 30 or so people for each one, and then kind of went down. This year, by the way, we are there's going to be a Zoom link to share candle lighting for people, who don't want to be alone when they do their candle lighting. So you can look every night, a different clergy or staff member is going to light candles with the congregation. So you can look for those links. And everything, by the way, is on our website as well. You can click on the Hanukkah button on the website, and it'll give you all the information that you need.
By the way, I just wanted to point out that how we would, it's very interesting how we would also say, actually, never, I was going to say that it's very interesting how we light the Shabbat candles before the Hanukkah candles, you said? Was that right? Or was it the other way around?
You would like to, no, Shabbat begins with the candle lighting, so you would light the Hanukkah lights first.
Right. And yet also at the same time, um, let's say that Shabbos and Yom Tov coincide. Typically, we would say Good Shabbos or Shabbat Shalom before we would say Good Yom Tov or Chag Sameach. So it's a reverse, no?
I'd have to think that one through, Ian. In terms of Shavua Tov, Chag Sameach, I'm gonna have to think that one through. All
Okay.
right. But thank you for the question. I'm now you got me thinking. Let's go on to our study for today. We are right the stories of Joseph, who is so beloved by his brothers right? His father, who did not practice any favoritism of a child, right? Right. I love all my children the same, but this one may be a little bit more than the same. I'll give him a coat of many colors. Let's see how that fares out with sibling rivalry.
Network.
The brothers conspire. There's a whole notion, and some of us have studied this together. Who really sold them to slavery? Who was surprised by it? Did Reuben really know? Um, and then we have that whole notion of, was he sold by the Midianites or the Egyptians? Like, it was a whole, remember that part, the travelers. And uh,
Right.
so Joseph, right, ends up in prison. And Eileen, how did he end up in prison?
Oh, the Pharaoh's wife
Correct.
accused
Right.
accused him of sexual whatever.
That's right. Impropriety, and grabbed his coat as proof of the indiscretion. Um, by the way, which is why, interesting for everything, Joseph, I don't know if he's known as Joseph HaTzadik, Joseph the Righteous. And where would he be known for this righteousness? Eileen, like, he tricked his brothers coming down, right? He didn't tell them exactly who he was. Was he the best of brothers or sons? Or he did take care of his family, but he's called Malim Joseph the Righteous because of that moment that he was able to refrain from the advances of Potiphar's wife and to act in a righteous way.
Uh,
Interestingly enough. All right, let's start. I thought we'd look, normally we're going to do Nahama Leibowitz, but I want to look at the story and how it bears itself out when Joseph is in prison, and his interpretation of the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. So Steve, will you start by reading chapter 40 of Genesis?
Did we say the prayer?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's do the prayer, please. Baruch. Amen. All right.
Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt gave offense to their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two courtiers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the prefect, in the same prison house where Joseph was confined. The prefect assigned Joseph to them, and he attended them. When they had been in custody for some time, both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, dreamed in the same night, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were distraught. He asked Pharaoh's courtiers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, saying, "Why do you appear downcast today?" And they said to him, "We had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." So Joseph said to them, "Surely God can interpret. Tell me your dreams." Then the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. He said to him, "In my dream there was a vine in front of me. On the vine were 3 branches. It had barely budded when out came its blossoms, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will pardon you and restore you to your post. You will place the Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as was your custom formerly when you were his cupbearer. But think of me when all is well with you again, and do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh, so as to free me from this place. For in truth, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, nor have I done anything here that should have put me in the dungeon." When the chief baker saw how favorably he had interpreted, he said to Joseph, "In my dream, similarly, there were 3 open work baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of food for Pharaoh that a baker prepares, and the birds were eating it out of the basket above my head." Joseph answered, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale you upon a pole, and the birds will pick off your flesh." On the
Ew.
third day, his birthday, Pharaoh made a banquet for all his officials, and he singled out his chief cupbearer and his chief baker from among his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not think of Joseph. He forgot him.
All right, that's the end of the portion. Any questions, just technical questions? No midrash yet, George? No midrash yet, no interpretations, just clarification. George, you're on mute though, if you do want to say something. George,
To,
did you
to me, the only thing positive is that Joseph made an accurate prediction.
okay, fine. All right. Rob. Wait, George, you're on mute though, so you're gonna have to unmute as well. Go ahead, Rob.
Isn't there a prohibition in
Okay.
the Torah against against psychics and soothsayers? And if so, why do we make a hero out of Joseph for being an interpreter of dreams? Good
That's a
point.
great. So what's forbidden in terms of the Torah? Witchcraft,
Yeah.
divination. George, what else can you think of that's forbidden? Um, of the dead,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But there's something here that's interesting that we're not hitting on.
Appealing to the dead. So, Rob, what's really forbidden is interpretations of whether it's the dead or other signs that determine behavior,
Yeah.
right? We're not allowed to do those things that are going to tell us what to do and how to act. Notice the dreams are simply a reflection of what's going to take place. Although Joseph's interpretation later on of the Pharaoh's dreams will result in a practical economic plan,
So, yeah, so,
right? So it's an interesting. It's a little bit, it's a great question, right? How does this different? And they try to make a distinction. All right, George, what do you got?
yeah, looking at line number 9, go back.
Okay, verse number 9. Hold
Yeah,
on.
9.
On.
I don't know how it's
Okay.
interpreted there. Okay. Okay, but in the Hebrew it says Alo Lelohim Pitronim. And then the art scroll says, do not interpretations belong to God. I mean, this guy's really into him. This is really God's interpretation. This isn't me. He didn't say
So
I'm interpreting. He says it belongs to God. So
okay,
somehow he's a conduit of this of this thing.
so what's the point about this? Give me a point
Well, he says
you're trying
interpretations
to listen.
belong to God.
Okay.
On number, oh no, that's number 8. I'm sorry. Okay. Surely God can interpret. Okay. But so he's not saying I'm divining. He says God is. Somehow he's got a pipeline, to the divine
Okay.
that's
So,
flowing through
so
him.
George, again, right? You're getting to an answer before we get to the
Okay.
question.
Well, there's a question.
So, in this stage, George always reminds me we want to phrase it in the form of a question or a point of clarification. And so, your
Okay.
question is, right? Is it Joseph or God who is divining this?
Yeah.
And that's what we're
Yeah.
going to be looking at today. So, George, thank you for making that point. Stan?
Well, dreams have a special place in Judaism and have had. There's a long discussion in the Talmud where the rabbis interpret dreams. Uh, so,
Of course. Look, dreaming. Rob raises a good question, right? And you are correct that there's a lot, right? The rabbis do believe in dream interpretation long before Freud and any of the others, right? Stan, you're correct. But Rob raises a good question, right? How are dreams different from the other divination and other things that are forbidden in terms of interpreting? It's not, right? It's a good question. And so, Stan, what you're saying is the rabbis clearly made a distinction, right? Um, I have to think, Rob, more about why. It's a great question. But
Perhaps
I don't want to spend too much time on this one.
I think I have a satisfactory answer.
Okay, Ian, go ahead. Why don't you share and then we'll go on.
So, I looked up the permissibility of using segulot, and Rashba says that a person who's sick should not rely on miracles or soothsaying, and Rambam, on the other hand, says that uh, it is forbidden to rely on incantation, say, to heal one's wounds, as opposed to, say, going to a doctor. So I suppose in order to reconcile these two differing opinions, we'd have to, and also taking into account the praiseworthiness of Yosef's prediction, we have to draw the line at, say, soothsaying that is ineffective, soothsaying that people do without any sort of guarantee that their prognostications will come true, which is also incidentally why we place such great reverence toward prophets.
Correct. So it's the fact that it comes from God, and I think that the part is true, Rob, that dreams are seen. Remember, uh, we just read about Jacob's dream. Remember? And so dreams are a way of receiving. So, Ian, when they talk about different types of prophecy, the lowest type of prophecy is in the form of dreams, according to the I think Rambam. So we'd have to it's a great comment. All right, let's go on to Nehama Leibowitz and let's read. Stan, you want to start us off?
The truth speaks for itself. The two ministers who were confined in the same dungeon with the Hebrew slave Joseph did not think him important enough to tell him their dreams. After all, he was not a magician or even remotely connected to the wise men of Egypt, that he should be versed in the art of interpreting dreams. But Joseph's statement, quote, do not interpretations belong to God, and it is he, God, who apportions of God's wisdom to even the smallest creature. Therefore, some now, I pray you, tell me, apparently had their effect on the chief cupbearer, and he divulged his dream. The chief baker held his peace and said nothing. He waited. Joseph gave some interpretation. Then the chief baker reacted for the first time. The text motivates his reaction. Go on.
Yeah.
And when the chief baker saw that he had interpreted well, that's the quotation. But the words of the text
Okay, so
are.
hold on. Thank you, Stan. Hold on for it. So I want to go back, and it's really, I think, significant to note that when he interprets the dream for the cupbearer, right? Who does he interpret it for, Stan? The cupbearer, right?
Yes.
But who responds? It's the chief baker who saw and look at how favorably he had interpreted.
Yes.
All right. George is going to look at the Hebrew and tell us that it says the word tov. So George, before you tell us that, that's going to be what we're going to be talking about. Okay.
Is that line 16? Okay. Just
exactly. But I want to point out,
you're right.
It's not the cupbearer, right, who says, "Oh, what a great interpretation." It's the chief baker who now is going to share, who's now going to share his his thoughts and his dream now. All right, let's go back on. Hold on one second. I apologize for my phone going off. I'm gonna reject that right there. Hold on. Let's go back. All right. All right. Let's go on. Linda, why don't you continue? Can you read?
Yes. Many have detected in our chapter a clue indicating
the words, sorry, but the words of the text are ambiguous.
Oh, okay, got it. But the words of the text are ambiguous. We have rendered the text literally, but the English version reads that the interpretation was good. Here are a number of explanations given by our classic commentators.
Right. So again, we're going to distinguish between good and favorable and perhaps even right. Right. So what does it mean when he when he says that the Joseph's interpretation was tov, and we'll make the distinctions here. So let's start with Radak David Kimchi, right? Who is he's sort of end of the 12th century, 13th century France. Um, so go ahead, Radak. Tell you what, Linda, I will. Can I see you leaning? Let me see if I can help you. All right. I don't like doing this because it like makes it a little bit harder, but is that easier for you?
It's fine, yeah.
Okay.
He saw in his heart by the hearing of his ears that the interpretation was favorable, and imagined, therefore, that he would give a favorable interpretation. Our
Right.
sages said too, all dreams follow the mouth. Joseph interpreted what he understood in the dream of each one according to his understanding, whether for good or bad.
All right. So according to Radak, all right, how does and this ties to what George is asking. Where does this interpretation come from? How does Joseph give an interpretation of the dream? Is it from God, George?
Yeah. Well, according to
Not according to
online.
Radak. Look at Radak. Hold on. Let me go back to the screen. I'm going to keep you honest here, George.
Okay,
Hold
go ahead. Well,
on.
obviously, it's a different answer. Go ahead.
Well, so because by the way, what I want there are multiple answers. Is that's the
Right.
important part, George. There's never one answer or response. So, George, let's look back here.
Yeah.
That's Joseph. He saw in his heart by the hearing of his ears that the interpretation was favorable, and imagine, therefore, that he would give a favorable interpretation.
Right.
Nothing about God here, right?
No, but is that the whatever the baker is thinking this? Who's he?
This is from the baker that he's hearing.
Yeah, he doesn't know anything about Hashem. He's an Egyptian.
Yeah. Why are you bringing God into this again, George? He's not saying anything about God here. How is
Well,
this is a very different interpretation, interpretive, if you will, quality, or anybody have a suggestion about what Radak is saying?
well, so far so good. He thinks, hey, this is
Well, but here, but listen,
good indication. We got a pardon or whatever. Hey, maybe I'm next.
okay, so no, I'm sorry. Um, right. So how did he saw it in his heart, right? The cupbearer,
Yeah,
sorry, the baker
yeah,
saw in his heart. That means, George, that he intuitively felt it was right,
yeah, yeah,
right? By hearing with his ears that the interpretation was favorable,
yeah,
right? So, and this is like uh, all the dreams follow the mouth. Actually this is from the Talmud, Ian, right? And Stan in those discussions, and
mhm,
it is the one who interprets it has that ability to understand. So, but again, nothing about that. It felt like it sounded like God or any connection, George, yet about how he was able to do it. Let's go on with the next one.
So if I am to understand correctly, by the way, it is the onus is both on the telling of the prediction and the listener to um to judge whether or not it's actually a favorable and accurate prediction. The the onus is on the teller to tell the truth, and the onus is also on the listener to recognize whether or not it's a good prediction.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian, for stating that concisely. Because Ian, later on, the question is going to come up. How does Pharaoh know that the interpretations by Joseph are correct? Right. So that's what we want to know, and it's going to come. Ian, we're going to talk later about what is truth. So you set it up perfectly. So I want to thank you for placing it in that in that context. Linda, are you ready? Now we're going to do. Who's next? This is going to be a Bravanel, which many of us know, right? He's the guy from Portugal during the Inquisition, and who's in the King's Court. Go ahead.
I can't read it because the left part is cut
Oh, but you
off.
can start the text recorded on the right-hand side. Then I'll move to the left.
Okay. The text recorded that when the chief baker saw that Joseph interpreted the chief butler's dream favorably, he also related his dream. This shows that the chief baker was worried and afraid to relate it, fearing that its interpretation would be unfavorable, had he not seen that Joseph had favorably interpreted the chief butlers. He believed that their dreams were in reality identical.
Right? So why does he now, George, say that he's what it meant by tov here is that it was a good interpretation. That is, that it was favorable and positive. Otherwise, if it was a bad interpretation, he might not have shared the dream for an interpretation. So the only reason that the baker was willing to share now is because the outcome or the interpretation was a positive end, right, Stan? Like that's where this is going. But we're not done yet, George, right? We're not done. Okay, let's go to Sforno. Right? So Sforno is like 15th, 16th century, somewhere around there. Go ahead, Linda.
It seems to start in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah, yeah. It's okay that he had interpreted favorably. It's okay.
Yeah, okay. It was likely, therefore, that his would also be favorable since dreams follow the mouth of the interpreter.
Right. So again, he's saying pretty much the same thing. There's nothing new here, but just giving, as Nechama Leibowitz and people like to do, here's another commentator who is sharing that the dreams follow the interpreter in the interpretation, and that it was favorable. And then Shadal.
All the above four commentators explained the word tov, good, in the sense of favorably. But except for Shadal, all of them are not satisfied with offering the verbal equivalent, but elaborate in an endeavor to answer a further difficulty. Even if we explain the text to imply that Joseph offered a favorable interpretation, this does not yet explain why this convinced the chief baker of Joseph's powers. Perhaps the Hebrew lad, the imprisoned slave, had fabricated the favorable interpretation in order to flatter and soothe these important personages for the purpose of self-advancement. For
So
this,
again, I want to pause. So hold for a second. We're trying to figure out here, the question that's being asked, and we're going to get into a deeper interpretation is, why did the chief baker believe that they were that it was a good interpretation, right? But what was it? Because Joseph just could have been trying like this false flattery, right? He's trying to make good, like giving them a good interpretation. So we're going to explore. We're going to come out of this in a moment to like the larger context. So go ahead, Linda. Continue.
For this reason, the commentators add an explanation clarifying what was at the back of the Egyptian's mind. He believed in the magical powers of the words of the interpreter. If he uttered with his lips a favorable interpretation, the words of his lips would force events to shape themselves favorably. If they were destined to take an evil turn, his utterance would deflect them from that unfavorable path. But the word tov in the text admits of another explanation given by Ramban as his first explanation.
All right, let's go to Nancy. Would you like to read Ramban, the Nachmanides, not Rambam, the Maimonides? All right, Onkelos.
Oculus explains that he interpreted it properly, as in Psalms 119:65. Teach me good discernment and knowledge, as in the text, for they were fair. This this man had looked down on Joseph and thought he would never know how to interpret it, and he would not have related to him his dream had he not has he not seen that he had a good job of interpreting his friend's dream.
Okay, so hold on. Yeah, so good. Perfect. Onkelos, by the way, is interesting because he has an Aramaic interpretation of the Torah itself, and so we get insight in terms of some of the interpretation. And so, what is he saying? Anybody want to take a shot at what Ramban quoting Onkelos? He interpreted properly. So he's trying to find out, George, what he's trying to do here is how do we interpret the word tov? How should we translate it, right?
Mhm.
So he's saying here it's not good, but it's properly. And he gives an example from the text, right, where tov is used for they were fair. And it's not good here, but it has another slight nuance of meaning the word tov.
Yeah, but maybe he's thinking, the Pharaoh is going to, have like a massive pardon or something. Hey, this is good news. The first guy's going to be executed. Hey, maybe he's going to really be tough. This may be a good indication of further, good news.
Again, like if it had, look, no one's, I mean, Joseph clearly is trying to, right, he's hopeful that, right, if things go well, that Pharaoh thinks, and they share that he gave the interpretation that Pharaoh might come out of it. We're trying to figure out here, right, what does it mean to interpret a dream and to know whether it's right or good, and how do we interpret dreams? So, Stan, were you going to say something?
I have a question. I know
Sure.
in English we have words and we have multiple interpretations and we interpret them in a context based on our own experience and whatever. For Hebrew, with they have very little experience, really, it's even more difficult to say, what does the word mean?
It is, and it's used in a different context so often, right? Like, and that's the point here. The word tov can have different implications based on context.
Um,
So that's what we're trying to get to. All right. Katav HaKabbalah. Nancy, you're reading? Go ahead.
Okay. The word tov implies perfection and appropriateness, beauty in.
Okay, hold on. Let me go to the top. Beauty and is contradistinction. Do you see it at the very top?
Oh, I say, okay, to ugliness, justice to injustice, and truth to falsehood, as in
Jeremiah, right?
Jeremiah
Chapter 1,
1
verse 12.
12. Thou hast well seen. The text, therefore, implies that he had given a true interpretation. The
Right. So
word,
it's not, so hold on this. It's not that it was a a good interpretation, but rather a true interpretation. Not good or favorable, but now they're trying to say, George, that actually it was a true interpretation. And now
Okay.
we're going to get to what does it mean in terms of correct, true, or false. Uh, let's say, Ian, are you interested in reading?
For sure.
Sure. The word tov.
The word tov, in their view, then implies correct or true. But this raises a serious problem. How could the chief baker know that the interpretation offered the chief
Slower,
butler?
Just Ian, if you don't mind, just a little slower, so we can have it
I
soak in. You're
apologize.
doing a great job reading. It's okay. How could?
How could the chief baker know that the interpretation offered the chief butler by the Hebrew lad was genuine, and not just flattery to curry favor with him? This question transcends the actual context of our chapter and the understanding of the chief baker's conduct. It involves the criteria of truth in general, how they are to be identified.
All right. So by the way, as I was reading this, it made me think about the lots of discussions today, Steve, in public place about what is truth. Right? What is truth? How do I identify truth? So as I was reading and just studying in general, I said like, oh, this is a good one to bring to the group. And I always look for topics that are relevant in our own time. And I just want to tell you like why I chose this to look at, because we're talking about how do we understand truth? Your truth, my truth. Does it go by the person who's sharing it? So now you understand why I picked this particular one. Keep going, Ian.
But before we answer this question, let us first ask another allied with this subject. Not how the chief baker knew the interpretation was the correct one, but how Joseph knew. The question is asked and answered in another commentary, Akedat Yitzchak. Both their dreams lent themselves to the same interpretation, for the picture of the bird eating the food from off his hand was similar to that depicted by the chief butler in I put the cup into the hand of Pharaoh, since the king is like a great winged eagle, see Ezekiel 17. But Joseph was influenced in his interpretation by the past case history of the dreamers, their status at court, and the difference between the crimes for which they were sentenced, marking one for pardon and the other for perdition. We see, therefore, that the evaluation of the interpretation is determined by the appraisal of the dreamer.
Right. So George, right? It's not right. Again, not so much about he channeled God and through him it was interpreted, but Akedat Yitzhak, who's a much more modern, if you will, commentator in terms of the ones we've been looking at, right? He's 15th century and he's Spanish, which means he's at that time, George, you know that, right? They were much more in terms of logic, right, and understanding, right? George, what's he saying? He's saying that Joseph knew about how they function in the court. He knew why they had been thrown in. He knew it, and he surmised, deduced from all that information how to interpret the facts. Right?
Yeah.
Right, George? Right.
No,
It's
no,
interesting.
no, except he had 100% batting average throughout all this, except for the 7 bad years. But if you can correct it, you can stay that. So he had this power from Hashem.
But why? But why are you? But you keep going to Hashem, and what I'm telling you is that Akedat Yitzhak here
Yeah.
is saying that he has there's a human component, right?
Okay.
That's why all the dreams go after the mouth. It's the interpreter, okay? So it's now. By the way, does it mean you have to be channeled and connected to God or whatever? But it's not that God's giving the interpretation. I want to make it clear, George. This is actually rejecting that
Okay.
and saying that everything goes after the interpretation of the mouth. The person who's interpreting is using lots of factors to create the interpretation. All right. I don't want to diminish God, right? But I just want to talk how we interpret dreams and in general, like as Stan was saying, like the rabbis really believe the dreams spoke to us, and how do we interpret them? Because George, you can't ask God for an interpretation of your dreams.
I'm not Joseph. Let's start with that. No, but he had 100% batting average. He had all kinds of things going
Okay,
on.
okay, but
Everyone
it
was
doesn't.
right.
But why do you have to attribute that to God? There
No,
are
no,
plenty.
it's it. No, I'm just saying. I'm just quoting what it
Okay,
says in the Torah.
uh,
Not
then
interpreting it. He says, "Don't interpretations belong to God." That's what
yeah,
Joseph.
but now the rabbis are
Okay,
trying to understand and
right.
go beyond that, George.
Okay.
That's the power of rabbinic, right? You're not a Sadducees, right? You don't stick to the literal truth, like the literal word of the Torah.
The only
Otherwise,
problem is you got 10 different interpretations here.
that's not the
You
problem.
know?
That's not the problem. That's what Ian loves about it.
I know, I understand that, but there's no like, here is the answer. We don't
But
have.
but George, that's the beauty of it.
I
Stan, go
understand
ahead.
that. I understand
Go
that.
ahead. Let's go on to Stan though, if we can, please. Go ahead. Stan, were you saying? Yeah, Stan.
Uh, the context includes the character of the dreamer. So that's what he's interpreting more than what the words are. So that's the context.
So it's interesting that the dreamer, right? And what Ian was saying before, the dreamer it has to resonate with the dreamer that the words spoken are the truth. And the cupbearer or the baker rather, right? He had a different, right? He was using different criteria, Stan, to determine he was right that he thought it was the truth, but it really wasn't, right? So that's going to be the issue. We have much more to do, so I want to keep going if we can. Who's reading right now? Who was reading? Ian, were you reading or no?
I was.
Okay,
All
read
right.
one more for me. Read Abravanel.
On the other hand, Abravanel objects to this explanation. If you ask how Joseph knew that they, i.e., the 3 branches or baskets, represented 3 days and not 3 months or years, I answer you that the Holy Spirit guided Joseph in his interpretation, not his own imaginative powers alone.
All right,
I
so
mean, can I just insert my own commentary here? I would
quickly,
say
sure.
I would say functionally the difference between you know the difference between being given the supernatural ability to predict the future and simply deducing correctly what the future is through reason. If functionally, I would say that they're very there's not much difference in practice. And I mean,
Okay.
after all, we say in the Amidah that Hashem is Chonen Adas. He is the bestower of knowledge and under.
Oh, so that's interesting. But that da'at that we have, Ian,
Yeah.
is that God gave it to us, but then God's not involved after that in that form of knowledge,
I mean,
right?
there are different levels of involvement.
No. But by the way, so da'at, right? Chabad, right? There's chokhmah, binah, de'ah. There's different types of knowledge, um, depending on how you interpret it. But some would believe in that God instilled us with, like Maimonides was big on this. God instilled us with this knowledge, and therefore it's up to us to utilize it. That's how we determine things by logic, because logic was God's gift to us.
Correct.
Right? So good. All right, let's keep going. Let's read. I'm going to skip, hold on, to the next page because I've got to finish this. And I'm supposed to be at a lunch for our staff in a little bit. We have been offered three answers to the question. Let's go right to there. And Rob, would you like to read?
I'd be glad to. We have been
Oh, I'm so glad
we
you
have
do.
we we have been offered three answers to the question how Joseph knew the interpretation. Perhaps we can learn from them the answer to our first question, how the chief baker knew. The first answer, that the Holy Spirit rested on Joseph, cannot help us very much since that certainly did not apply to the chief baker.
All right, so let's call this the George answer, right, George? No. But I want to say, and I
Okay.
mean,
All
seriously,
right.
like,
Fine.
yeah, no, George, you're right. It's one answer, right? One
And
answer.
Barbanel. I'll go with him. Use him.
All
Okay.
right, the Holy Spirit,
In the
good. All right.
name of a
Uh,
Barbanel.
okay, so
Okay.
Bravanel, very good.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go with that. Go ahead, Rob. The second answer.
The second answer indicated that Joseph's power of interpretation was based on his knowledge of what went on at the royal court. He knew what was cooking in the diplomatic pot. This answer may perhaps be valid with regard to the chief baker. Perhaps he too was familiar with the shifts of favor at court and the varying seriousness of the crimes for which they had been sentenced. But if he really knew then what couldn't he what why couldn't he interpret his dream himself? In the words of the Talmud, the prisoner cannot secure his own liberation from prison.
Now, hold on. That's the quote. We're going to go to the third answer. It's a strange quote and can be confusing because you're going to apply it to the baker being in prison, right? So it doesn't apply to that. But what it's saying is that you can't doctors, right? Can't self-diagnose, right? You don't often know, and it's somebody else. So Ian, what's interesting here is that often it's not how we interpret the dreams ourselves, but it's someone else who can put our dreams into a context that might be beyond where we are in that moment and utilizing other factors. Isn't that interesting?
It reminds me of the literary theory death of the author, where the original intentions of the author are irrelevant once their work gets in the hands of the reader.
Uh,
Uh, Interesting. That's a great. Thank you for that. It's really beautiful. Rob, let's go to the third answer right here.
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, it's been said that psychics, for example, cannot see their own lives. They can only see other people's.
Oh,
I s- you know what I'm saying? I don't know what
yeah,
I'm
I
saying.
love that. I
interesting.
love that. Oh, that's such a great parallel to this as well. Thank you for that. Great, both of you, Ian and Rob. Thank you. Go ahead.
The prisoner cannot secure
No,
his
no,
own.
we read that. So now we're going to
Oops,
third.
oops,
The
sorry.
third
The
answer.
third answer was a psychological one. Joseph based his interpretation on the details of the dream in accordance with what they taught him about the personality of the dreamer. This answer can fit our question too. The dreamer surely understands himself. Hadn't he really told him the dream, who he was and what he deserved in judgment? But here we must remember that modern students of dreams have taught us that.
Hold on. It's so complicated. Sorry, let me get that.
The dreamer neither wants nor is able to understand the language of his own dream. Abravanel in the 15th century formulated this idea in words that might have been taken from a contemporary manual of psychology. The dreamer on awakening remembers the empty symbols, the pictures, the parables, but forgets the significance, the illustration, the object of the symbol, which is hidden in the folds of his dream pictures, like the kernel in the husk. We cannot therefore be satisfied with this answer, since the chief baker, if he forgot or repressed the significance of his dream, how did he know upon hearing Joseph's words that he had interpreted well? Ooh. The Rashbam's answer.
Answer it. And that, like, so these are fascinating questions. I want to get to the, we could spend a lot of time talking. George, would you like to, George, did you read yet or no?
No, the
Okay, why don't you
Rashbam
read? Why don't
that
you go to the Rashbam?
the Rashbam's answer appears most plausible to us that the truth speaks for itself. In other words, the chief baker had no objective
Butler.
Butler, I'm sorry, Butler had no objective proofs, no clues to the detection of the truth of Joseph's interpretation. He was convinced by the truth because it was the truth. The phrase, the truth speaks for itself, was taken by Rashbam from the passage in the Talmud Sota 9b, discussing the perfidy of Delilah and her seduction of Samson. Oh, here, and when Delilah, keep going, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, how did she know? Surely he had told her lies on previous occasions, and she had found him out. Said Rava, the truth speaks for itself, said Abaye. She knew that righteous men do not utter the name of heaven in vain. As soon as he said, a Nazir to God am I, she said, now I certainly know he is speaking the truth.
Okay, so hold on just a second. So George, here, Rava and Abaye, right, have different interpretations about how she knew. Rava
Right.
said the truth speaks for itself. Like she recognized the truth. And
Mhm.
Abaye says, no, 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 no. Right? It was only because he invoked God's name and she knew, right, that he would never lie to invoke God's name as a Nazarite, that she knew that he was speaking the truth. All right, so you're going to finish it up, George. This is the conclusion. Go ahead.
Okay, according to Abaye, she was able to detect he was telling the truth by objective signs. According to Rava, she had none. But such is the power of truth that it bears its own telltale seal. This is its essence and strength, which requires no proofs. Often, the more important, the more profound the truth, the greater the impossibility of proving it bears witness to itself. This is what is implied in the phrase, the truth speaks for itself. So, okay.
Uh,
I mean,
so what are we
I mean, I
what do
mean,
we make of this? What do you take from this?
okay,
Maybe
first of
go ahead.
all, this guy, what was it, the baker? I mean, is this guy some kind of philosopher who's knows all this stuff, or he's just some simple guy? Hey, I heard some good news, hey, it sounds good to me. Maybe there's a massive pardon, maybe
Oh, so
the
by the way,
Pharaoh's in a good mood.
so hold on. I love what you're saying is some
Yeah.
people will give truth, will assume something's truth because it feels good to them.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, right? So
Right.
I think that's what you said. And by the way, that can be dangerous as well, correct?
Right, of course.
And clearly he was wrong about the interpretation that was, in terms of
Yeah,
the way it would come to him. So
yeah,
great, George, that's a great point. Hold on. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time and I want to get to
yeah.
just other people. That's a great addition, George. Thank you. Steve.
When I'm listening to the conversation, my perspective on this is that what is the goal of this the goal isn't it seems like it's digging very, very deep, where to me on the surface is making Joseph, recognizing Joseph has special abilities, establishing his reputation, and then becoming a major participant in in Egypt, in this new land. So to me, it's almost like we're focusing on minutia as opposed to the big picture. So
It's no, no, no. See, that's a great point. The big picture, you're absolutely correct, seems to be just a narrative about how Joseph, right, can ascend to that role and right, and the gifts that God gave him to interpret, like all of you're 100% right. But the rabbis aren't satisfied with that, Steve. And and by the way, sometimes they get into minutia, but sometimes like here, Steve, I think they're really trying to what they'll do is they'll try and derive real important messages about life from a narrative that probably had no intention of conveying that, right? So here
Okay.
they lock onto what is truth? How do you know truth when you hear it? Right? Isn't that interesting? Like, how do you know? And so, who else wants to add anything you take out of this in terms of, according to the mouth that we interpret, or how do we know truth? Nancy.
I'm just curious, all these people that are interpreting this thing, what are and it's all different in different spaces of time. Like, what are they basing it on?
It's a great question. They're basing it on a view of God, and then a view of human nature, and a view of people that is reflective of their time, Nancy. You're 100% right. Right? That's why the later that you have, and especially when you get into, 16th century Spain, like we talked about, they're going to have very different ideas about psychology, even though they wouldn't call it then, right? But they understand it greater, and they're trying to make meaning out of it. So I want to thank you for the question, but Sam, I'm going to give you the last comment. We'll tie it together in a second. Is that right? George, if somebody spouts lies all the time, are we likely to believe them
Right.
that they're
Yeah.
speaking the truth when they speak the truth?
Yeah. Okay. It's statistics, right? You see something's coming
No,
up a
no,
lot. Hey, we'll
but
keep
just
going with that. If he's telling that what he says it happens, hey, and it
no,
keeps
no, but
happening. That's good.
yeah, but George, I want to talk about people and forget about Joseph, forget about anybody
Okay.
else.
Okay.
When people in general, remember, the rabbis are taking this to human behavior
Right.
in general. They're
Right.
trying to pull it out of the narrative. That's what Rob was saying, right? Like, or it was Steve rather. Like, why are we pulling it out? Like, why are they doing this? But George, they want to pull out human nature. They always do that. You know that.
Yeah.
So here they're saying one of them would say, when somebody keeps telling you lies, you're less likely to believe them when they
Right.
say they're telling the truth.
Right.
So let's understand that. Good. Stan, I'm going to give you the last comment and I'm going to tie it together.
Well, my comment is general. The story is told in various ways, and we can ask how these events took place, assuming they did. But the better question is, why was it written the way that it was? And why did we tell this story in such a way that now that we're asking these questions and discussing it this way? And that's what I want to leave it with.
It is, and I agree with you almost always. And it's again from Steve to Nancy, that the rabbis often will try and create lessons from the Torah that stand are relevant in their time, right? Because the Torah speaks to each and every generation. And so how they interpret it for their general message will differ from generation to generation. Okay? And so this whole notion about truth and how do we know, and when people speak it, do we have to utilize do we just trust somebody at their word, or are there other clues to whether they're telling the truth or not? Or does it have to be accepted? Or like this is all part of the understanding. It's a larger question, and it comes in the form of the dreams. And I love that the rabbis explored these questions. Anyway, I do have to go with apologies. I've got to be in the meeting. It is great always to study with you. I will be here next week, even though it's vacation time, so we'll log on the same time. And looking forward to seeing you and wishing all Shabbat Shalom.
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 Good Shabbos.